Welcome back to another episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the church until today. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and if you haven't liked or subscribed to our show yet, please do so. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Carlos Ayer, the T. Lawrence Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. Welcome to our 50th episode, Carlos.
That's quite an anniversary. I'm so glad. 50 is a good number.
Yeah, I can't believe we've done 50 episodes. It feels like we just started the other day, but this is our third year doing the podcast.
Incredible. And I keep hearing from listeners, as you do too, who always are suggesting new things for us to cover. And now we have quite a list of new things to cover.
Yes, thanks to all our listeners for writing us, encouraging us, and giving us ideas for new episodes. And speaking of new episodes, today's episode sounds very interesting, to me at least.
Relics, yes. And what is the connection between relics and mysticism? It's not something one might, initially associate with mysticism, but they're very closely intertwined in various ways. The two are intertwined. And what is that connection? Well, let's start with the most obvious one, which is that there's a connection between holiness, which is the type of life of most mystics, is one of holiness. There's a connection between that life of holiness and their bodies while they're alive and their remains once they die. And just as in their mystical ecstasies, they reach up to heaven and some cases actually experience heavenly realities, their bodies reflect it. And that reflection can continue after they go to heaven. So the history of the veneration of relics is very closely tied to mysticism from very, very, very early on. So to better understand, or to begin to understand why there's this connection, we need to understand what relics are in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, and how the history of the veneration of relics developed over the centuries, and how it tied into the lives of the saints. It's a complex story, but I think that there are ways of approaching it that make the complexities seem less daunting for anyone who's starting out to study the subject. And especially because in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation rejected the veneration of relics. And that's a subject we can come back to today. But there are many Christians in the Protestant family who, relics have never been part of their life of faith, their piety and devotion. So it's usually difficult within the Protestant tradition to understand how it is that relics came to have the place that they do still have in Catholicism and in Orthodox Christianity. And, it begins very early in the Christian tradition. We see a glimmer of it in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles, where the bodies of the apostles can work miracles. And we read in Acts about people waiting for Peter to pass by on the street so that his shadow might fall on them and cure them of whatever ailment it is that they have. Or of believers touching objects to the bodies of the apostles, Peter, for one, and then carrying those around because they've picked up some kind of special power simply by coming in contact with an apostle's body. So it's there, it's biblical. And then we begin to see it, of course, especially in the 2nd century, with the persecution of Christians. And we begin to get accounts of martyrdoms. And we see how it is that communities that lose members to martyrdom begin to have a special reverence for their remains, if there are any, to be retrieved. So, for instance, one of the earliest martyrdom accounts is the martyrdom of St. Polycarp of Smyrna, 2nd century. Polycarp was in direct line of transmission of teachings from St. John the Apostle. And Polycarp ends up being martyred. And when his body is burned by the Roman authorities, we read in the account of his martyrdom that his community, members of his community, came back, gathered the ashes, and took them back to the place where they celebrated the Eucharist, so that he would be always present with them physically when the Eucharist was celebrated. And over time, this led to the practice, which is still very much in place in Catholic churches, that every altar is supposed to have a relic of a saint embedded in it. A very real, literal, material way of affirming the communion of the saints and the fact that the saints are still very much part of the living church in the material world, even though they are in heaven. So beginning with Polycarp, this begins to happen. And then especially when the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity in the 4th century and makes Christianity legal, that's when the Christians come out of hiding. So of course, they bring all these relics of their martyrs out of hiding, of places they had been buried, as they begin to build above ground churches, very visible. And Constantine is the great church builder. And Constantine's mother, Helena, actually travels to the Holy Land to see what relics she can scoop up that are related to Jesus and the apostles. And among other things, so goes the story, she finds the true cross, the cross on which Christ was nailed. And she finds the nails too. And they're brought back from the Holy Land, properly enshrined. And from that day forward, pieces of the true cross kept being taken off, because it's such a wonderful, such a valuable and wonderful relic. The cross. It's not just a symbol, it's the actual cross on which Jesus died, suffered. Well, this became one of the most highly prized of relics to be venerated. And as a result, little pieces of it, and some big pieces of it, were distributed throughout the Christian world. And by the time you get to the 16th century, we hear people joking about how many relics of the true cross exist, that there are way too many to be pieces taken from the real true cross. And Erasmus of Rotterdam, a critic of late medieval piety, joked, saying, well, it's amazing how the cross was carried by Christ, just one man. But now if you put together all the pieces we have that are supposed to be from the true cross, there's so many you could build an entire ship out of them. So, yes, but that's a whole other subject, is, the way in which fake relics were so valuable that fake relics began to multiply along with the genuine relics. And this has all been detailed very, very nicely in a very slim book, beautifully written by Peter Brown, the title of which is The Cult of the Saints. And he details how it is that Christians did something very, very different in Roman culture. Because in Roman culture, the living and the dead were supposed to be separated, which is why throughout the Roman Empire, burial places were always outside the city rather than in the city. But Christians now begin to bring the dead to be among them, especially in their churches, where they celebrate not just the Eucharist, but all rituals. And this is a very weird thing that, some Romans could not understand. Why are Christians doing this? But the overarching issue here and the overarching phenomenon is Christians believe that there is an intimate connection between the material remains of holy people and heaven. And of course, heaven is another dimension, it's conceived in the early Christian era and throughout the Middle Ages as a place. These holy people are close to God, and the pieces they have left behind of themselves, which includes even the clothing they wore, right? There are different degrees of relics. First-class relic is a piece of the body of a holy person, a saint. Second-class relic is something that has touched the body of the saint or had touched a piece of the body of the saint. So, for instance, items of clothing. But the Christian world filled up with relics of all sorts. And when it came to Jesus and the Virgin Mary, of course, Jesus went up to heaven bodily after his resurrection. So what could he have left behind? Well, all the instruments of torture connected to his passion, his crucifixion, were believed to have survived. And hence, Helena collecting the true cross, among other things, the crown of thorns. And, well, there's still controversy over this. The Shroud of Turin in Italy, which is supposedly the burial cloth in which Jesus was entombed, and which the gospel tells us was found by the apostles in the empty tomb. Well, the Shroud of Turin has this image of a man who has been crucified. And it's, of course, life-size. It's enormous. And scientists have been studying this shroud since the 19th century, because until the invention of photography, the image was very hard to see. But what happened is that the first photograph that was taken, the photographer, when he was developing it in the lab, back the old method of developing photos, the negative image came out. And the negative image of the image on the shroud is so clear. It just astounded everyone. And from that time until the present day, there have been scientific investigations. And the latest one, well, certain things were found that point to it being from the 1st century. Although there are other scientific investigations that say, no, this is from the 13th century, because that's the first time we ever hear about it. But not to get into another completely different topic, which is, the Shroud of Turin itself. Christians collected whatever they could that they thought had been related to Jesus and to the Virgin Mary and the apostles and the early Christian martyrs. And what does this tell us about beliefs in the connection between heaven and earth, or the living and the dead? Well, it tells us a whole lot. And it tells us that these mystics who have ecstasies, which bring them close to the divine, their bodies are never the same afterwards. And whatever remains of their bodies and their clothing is approached as holy and sacred, and as having the potential to perform miracles, especially healing cures.
I was just about to ask you about that, because I know there have been relics that have purported to bring about miracles.
Oh, it's, and as I said, you can find it in the Acts of the Apostles. Peter's shadow, which is actually, it's amazing. It's not even a material object. It's just his shadow. People claim that they're being healed by it. But yes, there are so many relics, and each and every one of them has the potential to perform healing miracles. We had a show on Padre Pio, a podcast on Padre Pio some months ago. Relics of Padre Pio are venerated all over the world because they have been distributed all over the world. Actually, a relic, one of Padre Pio's relics, came to visit, and I'm not putting quotation marks around visit. It was a real visit. Somebody brought it to my parish church here in Guilford, Connecticut. It was one of his gloves. Padre Pio had the stigmata on his hands. He went through a lot of these gloves because they were there to sop up the blood. So a glove came to church, and it was very clean. There were no blood stains on it. But again, with every relic, one can ask the question, is this genuine? And this is where the Catholic Church comes in, and they actually identify and validate relics as genuine.
Earlier this summer, and I remember I shared this with you, we were in Delray Beach and attended a mass on a Sunday morning there, and sure enough, they had a permanent relic of Padre Pio, one of his gloves.
Yeah. Apparently there are a lot of them. And I was amazed at how small it was in size, right? As a wool, it seemed like it was made out of wool, and it's one of those gloves that doesn't have the fingertips on it. Was that the same thing you saw?
Yeah, that was exactly the same thing. And I imagine he must have had hundreds of pairs of those gloves, because how long did he have the stigmata?
For decades. So yeah,
I'm sure he had hundreds of pairs over the decades. As you use them, you wash them. You can only wash them so many times. And as you wash them, if they're wool, they're going to shrink.
Yes. Yeah. And they become unusable. So, yeah, down to the present day, miracle working relics. And one more example that I think adds a real dimension to the practice of relic veneration and seeking healings from relics. After Teresa of Avila died, we read from various documents that the Carmelite nuns in Madrid had an inner garment that had been worn by Teresa around her midriff section. It was something like a girdle. And the word got out in Madrid that the nuns, the Carmelite convent, had this relic, and pregnant women who were about to give birth began to ask the nuns if they could borrow that, let's call it a girdle, borrow it when they were giving birth. And we have accounts of the nuns saying that there's always constant knocking on their door, people coming to ask for Teresa's girdle. So, yes, the relic itself of a piece of clothing is believed to have the same potential effect for curing as some part of the saint's body or the entire saint's body. It's a linking of heaven and earth. And there was constant interaction. The map, if you just think of a map of the Christian world before the 16th century, if you were to map where all the significant relics were, you would also be mapping the pilgrimage network, because people would travel, some cases hundreds and thousands of miles, to places that had very, very impressive relics. Rome was so full of relics. Rome was a major pilgrimage center. And then throughout the Middle Ages, there was the relic of the body of St. James the Apostle, which of all places was believed to be in northwest Spain. And the way that the story went was that St. James's body was brought there by angels, because St. James had, after Jesus's resurrection, traveled to Spain to spread the gospel message. So his body is supposed to be in Santiago, which is the Spanish word for Saint James. Santiago, Iago, I-A-G-O. And it was the most popular pilgrimage site other than Rome and Jerusalem throughout the Middle Ages. And it's still a very popular pilgrimage site, although nowadays people go on the Way of St. James, El Camino de Santiago, as it's known. People go for it for just purely cultural, not for religious reasons. It's a thing to do, and it's become very fashionable.
It's also become very spiritual. I know several people who have done a Camino de Santiago and come back talking about, an incredible spiritual experience.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one can never discount that at all whatsoever. And people who do it on foot, it's a hard thing to do. Walk hundreds of miles. But there are accommodations made for people who can't do it on foot as well. And I don't know what the statistics are, how many people go there per year, but it's just astounding how after so many centuries, it's still very much a place of pilgrimage. In Paris, they had the Crown of Thorns at the Sainte-Chapelle inside the royal palace. And in Rome, for heaven's sakes, you have St. Peter, you have St. Paul, you have all the early Christian martyrs. And in Rome, you can go from church to church. You can visit Rome for 2 or 3 weeks and not have enough time to visit all the churches that have important relics. And of course, some of those relics belong to some of the mystics that we have talked about in earlier programs. St. Catherine of Siena, her body is in Rome, but her head is in Siena. And, some of our listeners might ask, well, what's going on? Why are the saints dismembered? Well, it's a paradoxical reality. Because the relics are thought to be so valuable and so powerful, of course people want pieces of them. So ironically, out of respect for the saints can become dismembered and spread around. And that might seem like disrespect in the secular world, but it's one of these deep paradoxes of the Christian religion that, you spread the good stuff around. So it's possible to find pieces of saints, especially in Europe, almost anywhere one goes if you're dealing with a Catholic culture. The Protestant Reformation, a lot of those relics were tossed out. And we can come back to that a few minutes from now. But there are so many examples of the bodies of mystics becoming not just a relic, but very special relic.
So tell us a little bit about the connection between relics and mysticism. Are relics a part of the mystical quest?
Relics are not necessarily part of the mystical quest, but they can become points of contact with these people who were mystics and had these very, very special experiences. Mystics themselves can venerate relics and be very impressed by them, impressed in a religious sense, not just a cultural sense, and have special devotion to relics. But they're not part of the ascent of the individual's soul to the divine realm. They are points of contact, but the mystic, female or male, is more focused on prayer directly to God than on having a relic play any intercessory role in their mysticism. But many of the great mystics that we have talked about in our podcast, they end up becoming very powerful relics, which is what reason that, Catherine of Siena, her body is in one church in Rome and her head is elsewhere. And, Saint Teresa of Avila is a prime example of the effects of a mystical life on the body of a mystic, right? It's because in her case, her holiness is tied up with her mysticism and her constant and frequent encounters with the divine. And what happened to her body is very, very well documented. And not only is it well documented, just this past summer of 2025, her body, her corpse, let's use the technical term, her corpse, which has never decomposed, was dug up again. It has numerous times, and was investigated by scientists. We have yet to get the results of all these investigations, but there we are, 2025, and this is still going on. But back to her death and what happened immediately after her death. Well, she dies outside her convent. She dies as she's traveling from place to place. She has just been to Burgos, which is way up in northern Spain, and she has been asked to go to Alba, which is not too far from Avila. But she was summoned there to the Carmelite convent in Alba because the Duke of Alba, one of the most powerful nobles in Spain, wanted her there for the baptism of one of his grandchildren. But Teresa ends up dying in Alba of a hemorrhage. So what happens next is that the Carmelite nuns at Alba, realizing that they have this treasure, bury her immediately at Alba. And they actually place as many heavy rocks as they can on top of her coffin so that it would be difficult to dig her up. But they get to the more important part of the story, and we have many witnesses for this. A wonderful smell began to fill the chapel where she was buried. Very strong and very nice, powerful smell. Of course, the nuns knew this is part and parcel of the history of relics of saints, that this is the odor of sanctity. So they knew that there was something special about Teresa's corpse buried there in their chapel. So, to make this very long story as short as possible, her body was dug up a considerable amount of time after its burial, and it was intact. And her flesh was still supple. We get the description that if you pressed on her skin, it would bounce back when you removed your finger. And her body was not only intact, but also smelled wonderfully. But there's this one description of the smell when she was exhumed for investigation, that the smell was wonderful, but it was so strong, it could give you a headache. And when I read that years ago for the first time, I thought of all the times that I've gotten into an elevator with somebody who's wearing way too much cologne. It really does give you a headache of sorts. But what happens next is the Carmelite nuns in Avila keep asking for the body. It belongs there, they say. This was her convent. Oh, so there's a tussle back and forth. Who gets the body? Who doesn't get the body? Eventually, the case went all the way to Rome. And at Rome, it was decided that the body should remain at Alba, where she died. While this case is being argued back and forth, the nuns from Avila at one point have already gone to Alba, taken the body, and brought it to Avila. So now when Rome decides that the body needs to go back to Alba, it has to be carried, out of Avila back to Alba. But the nuns at Avila keep an arm. And then she begins to be slowly and gradually, the corpse ends up being diminished because so many people want relics of it. And there are relics of Teresa's body all over the world. Small ones, small pieces.
There's a controversial 20th century political leader who really loved his, I believe it was a finger of Teresa. A hand,
yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, during the Spanish Civil War, which, as some of our listeners might know, was a prelude to the Second World War. But it was actually a war between communists who were also very aggressive atheists and those who didn't want Spain to become communist. And on the side of those who didn't want to become communist, the leaders were the fascist party led by Francisco Franco. And what happened was the following. The communist troops, which loved to destroy churches and destroy relics and burn relics and kill priests and nuns, took over the city of Ronda in southern Spain, where at the Carmelite convent there was a relic of one of St. Teresa's hands. And the hand was in a reliquary. That's it. It was encased in this object shaped like a hand, made of precious metal, gold, I think. I can't remember if it was gold or silver, but it was sort of totally encrusted with precious stones, with jewels. So the communist troops see this very valuable object, valuable in terms of money, and they take it. They don't destroy it. And they took it to another city, and that city ends up being retaken by Franco's troops, and they rescue the hand. All this time, the communists, the Reds, they didn't know that they had Teresa's hand. They just thought they had all these jewels. Well, from that day forward, when Francisco Franco found out that the hand had been rescued, he asked for it, and he kept it by his side for the rest of his life. Never parted with it. Wherever he went, he would take the hand. And after he died in 1975, the hand, I think, went first to the royal family, but now at some point it went back. It's in Ronda again with the Carmelite nuns of Ronda. But it's an amazing story because he kept it on his desk most of the time. He traveled with it in his car, and whatever way he traveled, the hand traveled with him. He would not part company with it. But Teresa's body also is very common for these incorruptible corpses of holy people to ooze oil that has healing qualities too. And yes, hers produced oil. And this is, it's somewhat unusual, but it's not all that uncommon throughout medieval history, early modern history, and down to this day. This business of incorruptible bodies continues, not just because St. Teresa's corpse was examined this past summer, but just a few years ago in Missouri, at a Benedictine convent, the nuns were going to transfer the corpse of their former superior to another burial site. And when they did, they found out that her corpse was intact. And this made the news. This made the secular news. So some of our listeners might have heard about this case or read about it. Her name was Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster of the Most Holy Rosary. 4 years after her death is when they found the corpse to be intact. And this is, anyone can look it up. It's in the news. It's still being closely examined. And these things, amaze people in a very special way. And part of the examination that's carried out is to prove that there is no special embalming that has taken place, that this has been a natural/supernatural preservation of the saint's body. And of course, this nun Sister Wilhelmina, died just a few years ago, so she's got a long road toward before she can be beatified or canonized, but she's already being revered for this very same reason, as a holy woman who perhaps should be venerated. Well, next year in 2026, another great saint and mystic will have his body moved, although not very far. And I just read about this yesterday. Pope Leo, the new Pope Leo XIV, has approved the temporary move of the body of St. Francis of Assisi from the crypt in which he's buried in the lower church of the Basilica to be visible. Also in the lower church of the Basilica. He's not being brought up to the upper church. So the body is going to be very close to his tomb where he has been buried for centuries. But it'll be basically out there. Not clear whether, it will be on display in some kind of glass coffin or just be a simple coffin that's just there, close to people who come to venerate it. And this, I think, will go on for all of 2026 or for a good part of the year. If anyone has ever visited Assisi and gone to the Basilica and witnessed how pilgrims come to St. Francis's burial place, they know it can be a very moving experience because he's buried underground, but there has been set up right over his burial place a metal grill that is vertical, that surrounds the opening that leads down to his burial place. And people approach this metal grill, which is round. You walk around it. You can walk around it. It's circular. And then kneel in front of it. And people kneel, pray very softly. Or at least the times I've seen it, nobody has been praying very loudly. It's always been people like almost whispering very softly. And then they back up and someone else takes their place. And people very reverently pay their respects and plead with St. Francis for some kind of help. And next year, it will be even more dramatic because the people won't have to approach that metal grill. He'll be out there on the floor of the lower church of the Basilica.
Now, before we close this episode, you had mentioned earlier and said we were going to get back to it, and I'm really interested to hear about this, the Protestant reaction or the Protestant treatment of relics.
Oh, yes. It's part and parcel of the rejection of Catholicism by Protestants from very early on to do away with relics. And this cuts across all of the member families of the Protestant denominations. Saints are not to be venerated. Saints are not in any special position to help other Christians. And the main thrust of Protestant piety is Christocentric, right? Christ is the only intercessor. not the Virgin Mary, even, not the apostles, not any other saint. Christ is the only intercessor. The bodies of the saints, of holy people, have no special connection to heaven, and therefore should not be venerated. So, along with the images that got destroyed, many relics were also destroyed, and there would be, I guess they can be called counter rituals performed in the digging up of relics, such as, violating them in some very obvious way to show total disdain for them, smashing them to pieces, throwing them in latrines and sewers, in some cases feeding them to animals. And there was also a great effort put into unmasking, right, or revealing in some way that the relics were not genuine, that they were just nothing but fakes. And actually, John Calvin, the Protestant reformer of Geneva, wrote a book which some consider it very humorous. It'd be the only humorous book ever written by John Calvin. And the title of it is An Inventory of Relics. And that's precisely what it is. He lists all of these relics that had existed throughout Christendom and debunks them one by one. And as it turns out, in the 16th century and into the 17th, it was Calvin's best-selling book. It was very popular, very popular. So, he unmasks fake relics. He's obviously been able to do some research, and people have brought him accounts and stories of all of these towns that turned Protestant, where they went into the reliquaries and took the stuff out and discovered that it was not at all what it had claimed to be. Or using historical analysis, Calvin also tries to prove that none of these truly ancient relics, such as the head of John the Baptist, of which there were more than 7 throughout Christendom, that none of them could be the real thing. And how could it have been kept? Items that, were tied to the life of Jesus or the Virgin Mary. He pokes fun at the credulity of people. And, it needs to be said, yes, there were a lot of fakes. And there was an argument made, actually, in the Middle Ages, that the whole point of relics is the veneration that they inspire, and that veneration itself brings people closer to God. And so therefore, I think the argument was made tongue-in-cheek, was that, these things are so wonderful that God multiplies them because of the effect they have on people. So that would explain the 7 heads of John the Baptist. But that's not Calvin's take on it. His take is that everything, all the frauds are just proof of the fact that the Catholic Church cannot be the true church. And in Geneva itself, they supposedly had the brain of St. Peter. So says Calvin, and so say people who were writing before he did. Yes, and in Geneva, they took out that brain from its reliquary and discovered it was a pumice stone. That is, a stone from a volcano. So that, too, could be an exaggeration. To prove the falsehood of something, you make it something else that was ridiculous. So Erasmus's joke about the slivers of the true cross adding up to a whole ship, that's part and parcel of what became the Protestant debunking of the genuineness of relics. But it wasn't so much the genuineness that they objected to. Protestants just thought, this is just totally wrong. And we have to keep in mind that the mystical ecstasies of the sort that we have been talking about now for 49 podcasts Protestants rejected that kind of mysticism too. So the whole connection between body, soul, heaven, and earth is changed. It's lessened. And in some cases, it's done away with completely, with all the relics getting trashed, thrown out.
Well, one of our 50 episodes is an episode on Protestants and mysticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where we discussed a lot of this. But as we've learned, thanks to you, as we've learned that relics are not really part of the mystical quest, but play an important role for mystics and for those who follow mystics, what takeaway can you give us, me and our listeners, from all of this?
It's the takeaway, I think, is this belief, which you can find very, very early on in the Christian religion, that our bodies can be transformed into something greater than their purely natural state. That in fact, the promise of the resurrection is the ultimate goal, the ultimate end, promise of the salvation offered by Christ. We shall all be resurrected, and we shall all have glorious bodies. That glory begins here and now. And, someone like Teresa of Avila, she can die of a hemorrhage. And by the way, she was also starving because she hadn't had any food on this trip. She had some cabbage soup is all she had eaten. So she was very weakened. She's in pain. She's hemorrhaging. She dies. But her body is transformed. And as a matter of fact, there's this spin, and I don't mean that in a bad way, negative way, a spin put on her death, the fact that she died from a hemorrhage. Some began to say that this hemorrhage was not a purely physical issue, that in fact the hemorrhage was caused by the fact that in her final hour she went into such an extreme mystical ecstasy that as her soul was pulled towards heaven, her body began to bleed. Of course, 16th century understanding of medical phenomena being different from ours. But this is the kind of perspective that could be applied to the death of Teresa by hemorrhage because of this promise of a resurrection and a glorified body.
That's certainly something to think about. And a great 50th episode, Carlos.
Well,
what are you going to have for us for number 51?
One of our listeners has suggested that we take a look at a very unusual mystic, Emanuel Swedenborg, who was not Catholic and was not exactly Orthodox in a Protestant sense either. It's a very, very unusual mystic who ended up having a church formed after he died, the Swedenborgian Church, which is still in existence, and there are still Swedenborgians out there. So prepare for a very different kind of mystic with Emanuel Swedenborg.
Well, that's a great teaser. Thank you, Carlos, and thank you to all our listeners for tuning in. As we always do at the end of every show, thank you for reaching out to us. Thank you for the emails, for the encouragement, and for all your comments. And until the next time, this is the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eyre, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.